She had been running for 9 days, not the kind of running that looks like flight, not the desperate, stumbling kind that leaves a trail a child could follow. This was the other kind, the controlled kind, the kind beaten into muscle and bone over years of training until it no longer felt like effort and no longer felt like fear. Just forward, one foot, then the other. The body doing what it had been built to do long after the mind had run out of reasons to keep asking it. The Cascade Range in November does not care about your reasons. The forest at this elevation was old in the way that only the Pacific Northwest can be old. Dense and dark and indifferent. The kind of place where the trees had been standing long before any living thing with a name had walked beneath them and would be standing long after. The snowfall had started 2 days ago. Light at first, the polite kind that dusts surfaces and softens edges. Now it meant business. It came sideways in the wind, found every gap in her layered clothing, packed itself into her boot creases and the hollow beneath her jaw. Rena noticed all of this the way a general notices weather, as a variable, as a factor. She had stopped feeling it 3 days ago. What she felt instead, and had been refusing to name since the moment she crossed out of Iron Veil territory on foot, alone, stripped of everything that announced what she was something she had no useful training for. She had been trained for combat, for negotiation, for the particular kind of grief that leadership required you to process in private and present in public as strength. She had been trained to carry the weight of 300 lives in her decisions without allowing that weight to bend her posture. She had not been trained for this, for the silence where her escort should have been, for the absence of Vex. She shut that door the way she had been shutting it for 9 days. Hard, fast. With the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that if she opened it all the way, even once she would stop moving, and she could not stop moving. Not yet. Not until she understood what had survived and what hadn't and what came next. The tree line thinned slightly ahead. She smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke, the low sweet kind that came from hardwood burning in a contained space rather than the sharp piney smell of open fire. The smell of a structure. The smell of someone who had prepared for this cold ahead of time. The smell, if she was being honest, of the kind of ordinary human life she had spent 32 years standing at the edge of without ever quite belonging to it. The cabin sat at the place where the forest's edge met a narrow clearing. Small. A single-story structure with a stone chimney doing its job. A drying rack to one side hung with what looked like cured meat. A wood pile stacked with the particular neatness of someone who understood that sloppiness in November was a problem you paid for in February. A window. Warm light behind it. The yellow gold kind that meant fire and lamp rather than electricity. She stopped at the edge of the tree line and stood very still. She was, by any objective measure, a terrifying thing to encounter in the dark. She was tall enough that most doorways required her to duck. Her shoulders were broad in the way that years of weapons training creates, layered muscle over a frame that had been built by a people who lived in mountains and meant it. Her skin was the dark green of old river moss, deep and rich, though the cold and the hunger had been working at the edges of it for days now. Her tusks were small, ivory pale, clean despite everything else about her that was not. Her eyes were almost black. She looked like what she was, when she chose to. Right now she looked like something else entirely. She looked like something that had been walking a very long time and had run out of places to walk to. She crossed the clearing. She made it to the drying rack before her legs offered their first honest opinion about the past 9 days. She caught the wooden post and held it and stayed upright through what felt like sheer force of argument with her own body. The snow fell around her. The smoke from the chimney drifted sideways in the wind. The yellow light in the window did not move. She had stood in front of treaty tables with clan chiefs who wanted her dead. She had delivered her mother's eulogy 3 days after watching her die. She had accepted the Matriarch's mark with steady hands and a face that showed nothing while everything inside her was screaming. She stood at the door of a stranger's cabin in a snowstorm and raised her fist and knocked. What she felt in that moment was not courage. It was the very last of her options. The man who opened the door was not what she expected. She had expected someone larger. Not because she had any particular reason to, but because the cabin, the woodpile, the drying rack, the general evidence of a life built by hand in a hard place, All of it had suggested someone built for that kind of work. Physical, substantial. He was not small, exactly. His body had been shaped by labor in the specific way that good tools are shaped by use, lean, deliberate, nothing wasted. Brown hair cut short and slightly uneven, as if he had done it himself with functional rather than aesthetic intention. Gray eyes that were still in a way that was not vacancy but something more like depth. Hands that were rough from wire and weather, wet from whatever he had been doing before the knock. 31 years old, though she would not know his age for some time. He was standing with his hands still wet, looking at her. Most humans, when they opened a door to find Rena on their step, did one of three things. They stepped back, they reached for something, or they simply stood and stared in the specific paralyzed way of a person whose brain was renegotiating its understanding of what was possible. This man did none of those things. He stood in his doorway and looked at her with an expression that was careful and still and entirely focused, the way a person looks when they are actually seeing something rather than just reacting to it. And then something moved in those gray eyes, something that was not fear, not wonder, just a kind of quiet recognition. And he stepped aside. She said the only thing she had prepared. I have nothing to offer you, no money, no trade, nothing, only a request. Don't let me die on your doorstep. She had said it the way you say the thing you have rehearsed until it is the only thing left, without inflection, without the performance of desperation, because she had too much experience with desperation to perform it. The real thing had a flatness to it, a specificity, like the sound of a trap closing, or a last breath, or water when it has stopped fighting the cold. He stepped aside. She moved through his doorway sideways, her shoulders brushing both frames, and stopped just inside. The cabin was one room, a stone hearth that occupied a third of one wall, doing its job well, the heat of it hitting her like something physical after 9 days of nothing but cold. A work table scarred with years of use. 3 shelves, food stores, medicines, and small objects she couldn't examine from here. A curtained sleeping area in one corner. The proportions of everything designed for a person of his size, which meant that she stood in it the way a fact stands in a room, present, impossible to ignore, requiring some adjustment of everything around it. She assessed the exits, the fire, the food shelf, the single chair by the hearth, and then him, standing just inside the closed door, looking at her with that same still attention. She was waiting for the question, the one that came in various forms but always meant the same thing. What do you want? What do you need? What are you worth? What will you give me? She had her answers prepared. She was very good at answering questions she didn't want to answer. He didn't ask. He went to put water on for tea. Her sleeve had caught the door frame when she entered. Just for a second. Just long enough. The marking on her left forearm was not a scar and not a wound, and not the kind of decoration that people applied to themselves on a whim or in a moment of sentiment. It was dark ink worked into dark skin in lines so precise, so formally layered, so permanent in their intention, that they could only mean one thing: this was something given, not chosen. Something that belonged to a role rather than a person. Something that announced, to anyone who knew how to read it, exactly what she was. He had seen it. She had watched his eyes catch it, hold it for 1/2 second, and then release it as he stepped back to let her through. He said nothing about it. He never looked at it again. She sat in the chair he indicated with a gesture rather than words, and she watched him move to the fire and the pot with the ease of someone doing a familiar thing, and she tried to understand what was happening. She was very good at understanding what was happening. It was, in the technical sense, the primary function of her entire life's training. She could not get a read on this man. He brought her tea. He brought her dried venison from the shelf. She could see it was most of what he had, and half the pot of grain porridge he had clearly been planning to eat himself. He set it down in front of her without comment or ceremony, the way you put tools down when you're done with them, the way you do things that simply need doing. She ate. She had not eaten in 31 hours, and she did not perform restraint or gratitude. She ate because her body was past the point of social negotiation, and she let it, and he let her, and neither of them said anything while she did. The tea was bitter and strong. Willow bark in it, she thought, and something else she couldn't identify, something that moved through the deeper aches in her muscles with a kind of practical authority. Not painless, just managed. When the bowl was empty and the cup was empty, and she was sitting with both hands wrapped around the warmth of the empty cup, he did something she did not expect. He pulled his sleeping mat from the wall and laid it on the floor in front of the fire. He set his blanket on it. He sat down on it with his back to the fire. And then, without a word or a look, he lay down and closed his eyes. She looked at the curtained corner. She looked at the mat on the floor where he had arranged himself with complete equanimity. She looked at him. She was not naive about the world. She had been trained to read the strategic logic beneath every surface, the transaction beneath every gesture. He was lying on his floor while she sat in his only chair, having eaten most of his food, with his bed available behind the curtain. She was waiting for the bill. She ran the calculations. He lived alone, evidenced by everything about the cabin's arrangements. He had opened his door without hesitation. He had given her everything she needed physically without being asked. He was now arranging himself on the floor with the manner of a man who had decided something and was settled in that decision. The only explanation her experience gave her was the one she had encountered in various forms her entire life. Kindness as currency, patience as investment. The long game played by someone smart enough to know that demanding something immediately was less effective than making you feel you owed it. She waited. He breathed. The fire shifted. The snow fell outside and she could hear it in the quality of the silence. The way sound softens and muffles when the world goes white. He did not move. 1 hour. She had spent enough nights in enough field camps to know the rhythm of someone staying alert behind closed eyes versus the rhythm of someone actually sleeping. After an hour, his breathing had settled into something deep and unguarded, the particular rhythm of a person whose body had overridden whatever their mind had been doing. He was asleep. She sat in the chair for a long time after that, with the empty cup in her hands and the fire at her side, and tried to process what had just happened. She was very good at processing information. She was not, it turned out, very good at processing the complete and absolute absence of a hidden motive. She stood eventually, moved to the curtained corner, lay down on the sleeping frame. It protested her weight but held, and pulled the blanket over herself. She did not sleep for a long time. She thought about Vex. She opened that door, just once, just for a moment, in the dark of this stranger's cabin in a forest that didn't know her name. The river crossing. The sound that had come before she understood what was happening. The way Vex had moved. Not hesitation, not sacrifice performed for an audience. Just the simple, terrible efficiency of someone who had already made the calculation and was acting on it. 30 seconds. That was what it had bought. 30 seconds and a direction and a word that was not a request. Go. She closed the door again, carefully. The way you close things, you will have to open properly someday, but not tonight. Outside, the snow covered the clearing and the woodpile and the drying rack, and somewhere in the trees the wind moved through the high branches with a sound like breathing. And the cabin held the dark and the fire, and two people who did not yet know what they were to each other. She had been born in the Ironvale compound, a fortified settlement built into the north-facing flank of a Cascade Peak that her ancestors had chosen 6 generations ago for its defensibility and its access to the trade routes that ran through the mountain passes to the south. The compound was stone and timber and permanence, the kind of structure that took generations to build and communicated, in its very existence, the intention of a people who had decided they were staying. The Iron Veil were not the largest of the Northwest Orc clans. They were not the most feared. What they were was consistent, a people who kept their laws, honored their agreements, and had maintained an unbroken line of female leadership for 4 generations, which was long enough that it had ceased to feel like policy and simply felt like the nature of things. Her mother, Aldiva, had been the kind of leader that history remembers without needing to embellish. Not because she was perfect, she had made costly mistakes, had the scars to prove it, but because she had held the clan's trust through those mistakes by never pretending they hadn't happened. She had been clear-eyed in the way that only people who have fully accepted the weight of their responsibility can be clear-eyed. She had also been, in the private hours that were never quite private enough for a matriarch, profoundly alone with that weight. Rena had watched this. She had also inherited it. Grast had served her mother for 11 years. He was an elder of the Western Branch, experienced in the clan's internal politics, skilled at the kind of long-game maneuvering that was invisible until it was finished. He had been, by every observable measure, a good servant to Aldiva. What he had never been, though no one had known this until it was too late, was accepting of the idea that the next matriarch would also be a woman, a young woman. A woman who believed that the trade route expansion south through human territory was more strategically sound than the border consolidation through conflict he had been arguing for. He had spent 8 months building his case, not loudly, not visibly, carefully, the way water builds behind a dam, finding small cracks and working them slowly wider. Vex had seen it first. Vex, who had been training beside Rena since they were both old enough to hold practice weapons. Vex, who had the specific kind of alertness that belongs to people who have never fully trusted their own safety and have therefore gotten very good at watching the edges of things. Vex, who had said 6 weeks before the trade route journey, "Someone is building something, Rena. I can't show you the structure yet, but I can feel the weight of it." Rena had listened, had increased the escort, had planned the route with more redundancy than the journey technically required. It had not been enough. The ambush at the river crossing had been precise, military precise. The kind of precision that required exact knowledge of the route and the timing and the number of escorts, which meant the information had come from inside her own council. They had moved with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed, and they had targeted her specifically. Not the escort, not the supplies, her. The thing they were trying to end was her. Vex had been standing 1 step to her left when the first blade came from the right. She had moved to put herself in its path before Rena had even registered that it was coming. "Go," she had said, in the particular tone of a person who has made a calculation and is settled in the result. "Go now. The matriarch alive in exile is worth more than the matriarch dead here. Go." She had gone. She had run because Vex was right. She had run and kept running because it was the only way Vex's choice meant anything. She had run with 2 remaining warriors for 4 days until the second ambush, then with 1 warrior for 2 days until the arrow, and then alone, 9 days alone in a forest that didn't know her name. On the second night, she woke from the worst part of the dream. The moment at the river crossing, the sound, the thing she had seen and could not unsee, with a sharp cry that she stopped the instant she heard it leave her own throat. She lay in the dark behind the curtain and breathed. Across the room, no movement, no voice, no sound of him rising. In the morning, he said nothing about it. She filed this away with the other things she was learning about him. He rose before her every morning with the specific quiet of someone who had done this so many times it required no thought. He dressed. He checked traps he had set the previous day, returning before the light was full with whatever they'd caught. He reset the ones that had been tripped. He made food twice a day, simple and sufficient. He tended the fire. He worked at his table in the evenings, mending equipment, sharpening tools, the repetitive, purposeful work of someone maintaining the machinery of a life they had built with their own hands. He did not perform any of this for her benefit. He simply did what he did, and the cabin arranged itself around both of them without comment. She watched the way he moved through the space, efficient without being hurried, deliberate without being rigid. He had, she noticed, a particular relationship with quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, but the settled quiet of someone who had spent enough time alone that silence had become a preference rather than a default. He was not lonely exactly. He was solitary. There was a difference, and she had learned to read it. She watched his hands. He had good hands. Not large. Her own were larger by a significant margin, but capable in the specific way of hands that had spent years learning how to do difficult things correctly. She watched him set a broken trap spring with a focus that was almost meditative, the kind of attention that you give to small things when you have learned that small things done wrong become large problems. She watched him skin and portion the game he brought in with a practiced efficiency that was, in its own way, a kind of expertise. Her mother would have called it mastery of the useful. She had been watching him for 3 days when she allowed herself the first honest admission. He was exactly what he appeared to be. Not performing, not waiting, not building toward anything. He was a man who had opened his door in a snowstorm and let someone in because she needed to be let in. She didn't know what to do with that. On the fourth day, she began tentatively to do small things. When he left for the morning trap check, she stoked the fire and moved the water pot. When he returned from a longer afternoon track, she had brought in 2 armloads of wood from the pile outside and stacked them against the hearth wall with a precision that was slightly excessive, the habit of someone who had spent their life doing everything to a standard and did not know how to do less. He came in from the cold and stood for a moment looking at the stacked wood. He said, "That's helpful. Thank you." His tone was the same tone he used to note that the weather was clearing. She looked at him with an expression she knew was too complicated for the moment. She could feel it, and she could not fully organize it before he had already turned back to what he was doing. What she felt was something she had no precise word for in his language, and only an approximate one in her own. Something between suspicion and recognition, between waiting for the bill that still had not come and beginning to suspect, cautiously, distantly, that there might not be one. She did not name it yet. She told him her name on the 5th evening, just her first name. No title, no clan designation, nothing that placed her in any larger context. He told her his, Rowan. She repeated it once quietly, the way she filed things that mattered. On the 19th day, she could no longer manage the injury. She had known about the cuts since the river crossing. 3 of them, along her left side from the first blade that had been meant for her chest and had caught her flank instead when she'd moved. She had packed them herself with what she had, moss, bark, tight binding, and managed them with the particular stoic discipline of someone who had been trained to keep moving regardless of what her body was telling her. Pain was information, noted, filed, addressed when circumstances permitted. The circumstances had not permitted. Now one of the cuts was warm, not aching warm, hot warm, the specific heat of infection, which was a different problem from pain and one that did not respond to willpower. She came out from behind the curtain that morning, moving more stiffly than the day before. He was at his work table with the morning's first task already in his hands, and he glanced up when she emerged and then looked back at what he was doing. A moment later, without comment, he set something on the corner of the work table closest to her. A small cloth pouch. She recognized the smell. Willow bark and dried nettle and one other thing she couldn't immediately identify. He said without looking up from his work, "Mixed into hot water. It'll help with pain in the ribs and the deeper muscles." She looked at the pouch. She looked at him. She picked up the pouch. He had turned back to his work before she heard the sound leave her own body. It wasn't words. It wasn't quite language. It was the exhale of someone who has been holding themselves absolutely rigid for a very long time and has, for just one unguarded moment, allowed the smallest fraction of that tension to release. Not gratitude. Something before gratitude. The thing that happens before a person is ready to be grateful. The moment when they first understand that needing something and admitting to needing something might not, in this particular place, be the same thing as being vulnerable. He pretended not to hear it. She suspected he heard everything. On the morning of the 21st day, she stopped at his work table and said, without preamble, "I think one of the cuts on my left side may be infected. If you have knowledge of such things, I'll allow you to look at it." He set down what he was holding. He got his mother's medicine kit from the middle shelf. The one she had noticed was kept better organized than anything else in the cabin. And he pulled his best candle from the supply, and he said simply, "I'll need good light." He waited while she decided what to do about the exposure that examination required. She pulled the upper layers of her clothing up on the left side and held them, and he came close and looked. What he found was 3 cuts. Long ones, clean-edged, the precise kind that came from a blade wielded by someone who knew how to use it. They had been treated. Packed with moss and bark, bound tight. One of them was warm to the touch in a way that told him exactly what was happening inside it. She watched his face. His expression did not change. He told her what he was going to do and in what order and why. He did not ask for permission. She had already given it. But he described each step before he did it, in the calm, factual tone of someone communicating rather than managing. And she understood with a certainty that settled somewhere below conscious thought that this was not technique. This was how he had been taught. The difference between tending a wound and violating someone's body was this: whether they knew what was coming, whether the hands doing the work had been asked to be there. His hands were careful, She had a high threshold for pain. She had been trained to that threshold deliberately and had spent years reinforcing it. She held still through what he did without difficulty, and the steadiness cost her nothing. And she found herself thinking about that, about the difference between holding still because it costs nothing and holding still because you cannot afford to show that it costs something. For the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, it was the former. When he was finished and moving to the water basin to clean his hands, she said something that came out in the careful, measured way of words that were true and therefore required more effort than words that weren't. She said, "You have good hands for this." He said, without turning around, "My mother taught me." She said she must have been a good woman. He said she was the best person I knew. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the first silence between them that was not, in some way, the silence of two things being careful around each other. It was just quiet. The fire, the snow outside, the smell of the comfrey and calendula he had used on the wounds. She moved to the chair by the fire. He turned and picked up the trap spring he had been mending and went back to work. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the morning. It was the most at ease she had felt in 21 days. The rhythm came without planning. That was the thing about it. Neither of them sat down and decided how the days would go. It simply happened the way a river finds its course, not by choice, but by the patient logic of water and gravity and whatever the land allows. He rose before her. She started the fire before he returned from the traps. He made the morning meal. She ate. And then she found something that needed doing and did it, and he found something that needed doing and did it, and the cabin held them both without requiring either of them to explain why they were there. She had spent 32 years in a world where every arrangement had a name, every role had a title, every relationship had a designated shape that told you what was expected and what you owed and what you were permitted to want in return. She had been trained in the grammar of obligation the way other people are trained in language, deeply, early, until it felt like thinking itself. This had no name. She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she could not immediately categorize. She observed, she gathered data, she waited for the pattern to reveal itself. What revealed itself slowly over the days that followed was something she had no existing framework to receive. He was not performing equanimity. He was equanimous. There was a difference. She had spent years around people who performed it, and she knew the tells, the slight effort behind the stillness, the way the calm was maintained rather than inhabited. His calm was inhabited. It lived in him the way his knowledge of the forest lived in him, not as an achievement, but as a condition. She found this, without entirely meaning to, the most disorienting thing about him. She learned his mastery. Every person had one, the territory where their competence was not effort but second nature. His was the forest, and the things the forest gave, and the knowledge of how to receive what was offered and preserve what was taken. She watched him move through the trees on the one morning she followed him to the first trap line, not because he invited her, but because she had been inside for 17 consecutive days, and her body was beginning to communicate its opinions about this with increasing clarity. He had glanced at her when she pulled on her outer layer, said nothing, held the door. In the forest he was different, not dramatically different, not transformed, just more fully himself, the way a person is when they are in the place that knows them. He moved without hesitation. His attention distributed itself across the environment in a way she recognized because she had it too. Not focused on one thing, but open, receiving information from the whole field, the way hunters and warriors learn to see because narrow focus gets you killed. He noticed things she had not noticed, small tracks in the snow, a bent branch that told a story, the absence of bird sound in one direction that meant something was there that hadn't been there yesterday. He was good at his work. She found unexpected comfort in this. Competence, in her experience, was one of the few genuinely universal currencies. It required no translation. You could not fake it in a forest at 30 degrees, and it revealed character in ways that conversation never quite managed. On the walk back, she said, "You enjoy this." Not a question. He considered it as they walked. Then he said, "I like that it's honest. The forest doesn't tell you it's fine when it isn't." She turned this over. "Neither does the cold." "No," he said, "neither does the cold." They walked the rest of the way back in a silence that had stopped being the careful kind. The game board appeared on the 10th evening. He got it out without announcement, set it on the floor between them. He had long since stopped using the chair, leaving it for her as a matter of course that neither of them discussed, and lit the tallow lamp and began arranging the stones. The board was hand-carved. She could see where the grid lines had been made with a blade and a patience that was not natural talent, but the product of time and a need to do something with one's hands. The pieces were river stones, sorted by color, dark for him, light for her, without asking. He explained the rules. She listened, asked 3 questions that made him pause and reconsider one of the rules mid-explanation, and then they played. She won the first game in 11 moves. He looked at the board for a moment when it was over, with the expression of a man reviewing an architectural failure with genuine interest rather than embarrassment. "You saw the corner strategy before I finished explaining the rules," he said. "The corner strategy wasn't in the rules," she said. "There's nothing in the rules against it." "That's the problem with the rules." "It's not a problem with the rules," she said. "It's an invitation." He looked up. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile, the predecessor of one. They played the second game. He won it, somewhat to his own apparent surprise, when she overcommitted to a central position and he found an angle she had not accounted for. He studied the final arrangement with the focused satisfaction of a man who had understood something rather than simply gotten lucky. "You weren't watching the edges," he said. "I was watching the center." The center looked like the game. She looked at him. "Where was the game?" "The edges." She looked at the board. She looked at him. In her clan, the strategy training had been formal and comprehensive. Tables, scenarios, opponents chosen for their different approaches. This man had invented his own game out of boredom and stubbornness, and had taught himself to play it well by playing against nothing for years. And he had just beaten her by understanding its structure better than she had after one game. She was not accustomed to being beaten. She found she did not mind it. The third game went to 27 moves, the longest of the evening. She won it, but it took longer than it should have. And at the end of it, she was aware that he had been studying her, thinking the entire time, and would use what he had learned. He poured more tea for both of them, and she found herself saying something she had not planned to say. In the Iron Veil, the strategy training starts when you're old enough to understand that a decision can cost a life. It stops feeling like a game somewhere in the first year. He was quiet for a moment in the listening way rather than the waiting way. "Is that when it starts feeling like responsibility?" "No," she said, "that comes later. When you're the one making the decision for the first time, and you understand that no one else can carry what comes after it." She had not said that to anyone before. She had thought it many times alone, in the hours after difficult counsels when she sat with the weight of what had been decided and felt the specific loneliness of being the last point at which the weight stopped. But she had not said it aloud because there was no one to say it to who was not also part of the structure that required her to appear without that weight. He said, "That sounds very heavy to carry alone." She said, "It is." Then she moved her stone, and the conversation found a different shape, but the room felt lighter than it had before. The specific lightness of something that had been held too long, finally given a small amount of space. She thought about that for a long time after he was asleep. The thaw was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive in a single moment where something broke open and became different. It accumulated the way snow accumulates, one layer at a time, each one too thin to notice, until one morning you look up and everything has changed. She found herself reaching past him for her cup rather than waiting for him to pour it. She found herself making a comment in her own language about the way he cut root vegetables before she had registered she was going to speak, and he turned and asked what word she had used, and she told him, and the word had no equivalent in his language. It meant something like the right thickness for something that takes less time to cook than the thing it's cooked alongside. And he attempted to say it. He failed completely. She said it again, slower. He failed again. A third time, more carefully, each syllable given its weight. He said it for the fourth time, and it was worse than all the previous attempts. Definitively worse. A new category of wrongness that should not have been achievable from the starting point. And she laughed. Not the measured, controlled sound she produced in councils when something was amusing and it was appropriate to indicate this. Not the polite acknowledgement of humor between people who do not fully trust each other. Something real, short, sudden, completely unguarded, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can catch it. The part of a laugh that exists before the social mind gets there and decides what is and isn't appropriate. It lasted exactly 2 seconds. She covered it immediately. He pretended not to notice. She was certain he noticed everything. He would cut the root vegetables thinner than she thought correct. She would fix them, efficiently and without comment. This became the shape of their cooking together without discussion, without naming it as a shape. The carving happened on the 35th day. He came in from the morning trap check with a better catch than usual. 2 rabbits and a young fox, enough to smoke and store against the deep cold that was still ahead. He was in an unusually good mood when he came through the door. Good catch days had that effect on him, simple and reliable as weather. And he had brought the cold air in with him, along with the satisfaction of work that had gone as it should. He stopped in the doorway. She was at his work table. She had taken 2 pieces of scrap wood from the offcuts pile he kept near the hearth, and she was working one of them with his smallest carving blade. Her enormous hands moving with a precision that was incongruous with their size and entirely in keeping with everything else about her. She heard him come in and looked up immediately. Not guilty, but watchful. The defensive readiness of someone who had been doing something private and was prepared for it to be questioned. He set his catch on the counter. He looked at the work in her hands. It was small, perhaps the size of his fist. Still rough, still in the early stages of becoming something, but the intention was already visible in it. 4 legs, a broad body, a head that was proportionally larger than realistic. He couldn't quite tell what it was yet. He looked at it for a moment. "What is it going to be?" he asked. She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "A stone guardian." That is the closest translation. In my language, the word is older. It means the dogs that appear in the oldest ancestor stories of the Iron Vale. Before the stone hall was built, before the compound existed, when the clan was still finding its place in the mountains. She looked at the carving. They were supposed to be carved and placed at the threshold of a new home, to bring safety to the place, to tell whatever came looking that someone was watching. He set down the rabbit he was skinning and looked at the small, rough figure. Something shifted in his chest. Quiet, significant, the particular sensation of a door that has been closed for a long time receiving the first breath of outside air through its cracks. He said, "That sounds like something my mother would have believed in." She looked at him with the focused attention she gave to things that arrived unexpectedly. He was not looking at her. He had gone back to his work, hands moving with the automatic competence of long practice. And there was something about the fact that he had set it to the work rather than to her face that made it easier to receive. Like something offered with an open hand rather than attended and waiting to be taken. What did she believe in? Rena asked. He told her, not all of it at once, in pieces, the way he told everything that mattered, a piece at a time, leaving space between them so the next piece could be set down properly. His mother's herb garden and the names she gave things in it, not the botanical names, her names, the private names she assigned to particular plants, the small rituals she built around the ones that were struggling. The way she talked to the sicker specimens in the morning before anyone else was awake, standing in her garden in the early light with her coffee going cold in her hand. He said, she believed that the things you tended knew they were being tended, that attention was its own kind of medicine. Rena listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, the rabbit was portioned and the fire was built up and the smell of cooking was beginning to fill the cabin. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still on the carving. Then she said, in the Iron Vale, the Matriarch is the keeper of the old names. Every plant, every pass in the mountains, every location where something significant happened. They all have the first name and the current name. The Matriarch holds both. She paused. It is considered the most important part of the role, not the law-keeping, not the battle decisions, the names. Because you cannot remember what you cannot name, and you cannot protect what you do not remember. He said, that makes sense to me. And she said, I have not spoken about that with anyone in a long time. He said, I know how that feels. They cooked the rabbit together, and somewhere in the middle of it, she made a quiet correction to the way he was adding the dried herbs. Too much at once, she indicated with a gesture toward his hand holding the jar, and he adjusted without comment, and she seemed faintly surprised by the adjustment, as if she had half expected the pushback that hadn't come. He looked at the carving on the work table, resting in the curve of a scrap of bark she had placed under it to keep it steady while the work dried. He said, "Will it be done before you?" He stopped. He started again. "Will it take long to finish?" She understood what he had not said. She looked at the carving, then at the shelf above the window where the three things sat. The carved bird, the copper coin with the hole through its center, the small dried arrangement of herbs that smelled like something that no longer existed. She said, "I will finish it before I go." He nodded. He did not say anything else about it. But that night, after she had gone behind the curtain and the cabin was quiet, he sat for a while at his work table looking at the rough figure taking shape in the scrap wood. And he thought about thresholds and watching and the things that are placed at the entrance of a new home so that whatever comes looking finds something already there. The wolf came on the 32nd day. Rowan had come inside earlier than usual because the afternoon trap check had taken longer than expected, a problem with the east line that he had needed to address, and she had been in the middle of oiling the door hinges when he stamped the snow off his boots and came through. He said something about the east line. She asked a question about the mechanism. They were in the middle of that exchange when the sound came from outside. Not an alarm, not exactly. Just a shift in the quality of the quiet that both of them registered at the same moment. The specific silence that means something large is being very still, very nearby. Rowan moved to the window. "Looked," he said, with the flat tone of information. "Wolf, large one, standing about 10 feet out." She crossed to the window. It was a gray wolf, the kind that had no business being this close to a structure, and knew it and had come anyway, which meant it was either desperate or calculating. And from the look of the animal, the yellow eyes patient and steady, the posture of a predator that had been cold long enough to have revised its risk tolerance, it was both. The smoked meat on the drying rack, the smell of the smoking that had soaked into the cabin walls and drifted out through every gap in the weather seal. The wolf was making an argument. Rowan reached for the bow he kept by the door. She was already moving. She was not conscious of deciding to move. Her body made the decision before her mind had framed the question, the way the body does when it is doing something native to itself. She crossed the cabin and went through the door and stepped past him on the threshold, close enough that her arm brushed his shoulder, and turned to face the wolf. The wolf looked at her. She held the eye contact without flinching, without aggression, without the particular kind of stillness that means suppressed fear. She held it with the simple, settled confidence of a creature that has never, in 32 years of life, been required to assess whether it was the most dangerous thing in a given space, because it always had been. And then she made the sound. It came from low in her throat, below the larynx, below the place where his language lived. It was not a word. It was not a growl. It was something older than either, something that existed in the part of the world that predators share regardless of species. An acknowledgement, a communication of presence to presence, a statement that said simply, "I am here. I see what you are. I am what I am." The wolf stood very still. She held it. One breath, two. The wolf turned, not quickly, not with the sudden withdrawal of a frightened animal. It turned the way a thing turns when it has made a decision that it is satisfied with, and it walked back into the tree line with the unhurried dignity of a predator that has simply concluded the current situation is not worth the cost. The tree line took it, and then there was just the clearing in the snow and the cold air, and the two of them standing at the cabin door. Rowan said after a moment, "I've never seen anyone do that." She said, "Wolves test for edges. They find the boundary of a thing, and if it's further than they expected, they adjust." She said it the way you say practical information. The way you note that the ice on the river is thicker this year than last. The way you say the thing that is obvious to you and have momentarily forgotten is not obvious to everyone. He looked at her. She was watching the tree line with her jaw set and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. And she was in that moment, in that specific unguarded way, more fully herself than he had seen her in 32 days. Not the careful, measured person of the early weeks. Not the slow, careful thing that had been defrosting layer by layer. Just herself. Certain, settled in her power, at ease in it in a way she was not always at ease in his small cabin with its human scale everything. She turned and found him looking at her. He looked away first. Back at the tree line, he said, "We should go inside. It's cold." She said, "It's cold." They went inside. He did not say anything about what he had seen, but she had caught the look in the half second before he turned away, and she recognized it because she had been trained to read faces the way he had been trained to read forest tracks. Not as a skill applied deliberately, but as a reflex, continuous and automatic. It was not the look of someone seeing something frightening. It was the look of someone seeing something they had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting to see. The floor repair happened on the 42nd day. A section near the cold room door had been swelling from the damp, the boards gapping at the joint in a way that was going to become a structural problem before spring. He had the materials for it and had been working up to the task, which required holding a plank in place from one side while working the peg and hammer joint from the other, a thing that was simply not possible alone. He did not ask her. He set out the materials and began working and waited. She watched him for a moment and then came to the floor and put her hand flat on the plank to hold it, and that was that. They worked in the close, functional proximity of people doing a physical task together, not talking, because the task did not require talking, and they had both stopped filling silence some time ago. The fire was lower than usual. The lamp was lit, and when the last beam shifted to throw its light at a different angle, it caught the ring. She wore it on her right hand, the band turned so the face pressed into her palm. She had worn it that way since the river crossing. He had noticed it in the first days and filed it with the other things he was not asking about. In this light, for the first time, the face of the ring was toward him. He looked at it for what he estimated was 1 full second before looking away. It was long enough. The design was not decorative. It was the visual grammar of authority, the specific, dense, deliberate patterning of a clan seal, the kind that communicated not just identity, but position. Not just who, but what. Not a warrior's mark, not a counselor's. Something above those categories entirely, the kind of seal that belonged to the person at the top of the structure who was answerable not to any individual, but to the whole. He drove the last peg home. He sat back on his heels and let the quiet run for a moment. Then he said, without looking at her, "That ring." She went still. He said, "I'm not asking about it. I just want you to know I've seen it. And whatever it means, it's yours to tell me or not." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. The firelight moved on both their faces, and outside the snow had started again, and the sound of it was very far away. She said, "When the time comes, I'll tell you everything." He said, "All right." He got up and went to wash the sawdust from his hands. She sat on the floor beside the repaired boards for another long moment, her hand flat against the wood, the seal of the Iron Veil Matriarchs pressing into her palm. She thought about what it had cost her to say "when the time comes" instead of "I will tell you nothing." It had cost her less than she expected. That was the most significant thing that had happened in 42 days. The 43rd day. He had been following tracks on the east side, something interesting, worth setting for, and he came back later than usual, the sky already moving toward the pale blue of early winter dark. He saw the open door before he was halfway across the clearing. Not abandoned open, not left by accident open. There was light from inside, and the fire was going, and there were shapes in the warm rectangle of the doorway that were not the shapes of the cabin's usual furniture. He stopped for 1 full second. Then he walked to the door and went through it and closed it behind him. 2 orcs, both warriors, the kind whose bearing and equipment could not be misread regardless of what they were or weren't wearing. A woman with the hard expression and senior insignia of someone who had been in the field for weeks and had not once, during those weeks, allowed herself to fully rest. A younger warrior behind her, broad-shouldered, eyes moving through the room with the automatic assessment of someone trained to never stop assessing. Rena stood in the center of the room. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face. It was not composed. It was not measured. It was the honest expression of someone feeling multiple things simultaneously and not currently able to sort them into the manageable order she preferred. He read it the way he had learned to read her, not from single features, but from the whole, the specific combination of muscle and tension and the thing behind the eyes. I did not want this yet. You were always getting to find out. I am sorry for what comes next. She said his name, just his name, without the formal distance of the early days. Then she said, these are my people. They've come to find me. The senior warrior said something fast and clipped in the Orc language. Her eyes moved to him in the assessing way and stayed there. Rena answered in kind, and the exchange between them had the specific quality of something being negotiated, something being peddled in a language he could not follow, but could read in posture and breath, and the way the senior warrior's evaluation of him shifted, recalculated, adjusted. Then Rena looked back at him. She said in his language, with the particular care of someone choosing each word for its exact weight, we need to speak. He said, yes, I imagine we do. He sat down on the floor. He had given the chair to the senior warrior and the stool to the younger one without being asked. And then he sat with his forearms on his knees and waited. Her name was Sable. She had been Rena's field captain for 6 years. She had survived the ambush at the river crossing with 2 trackers and had spent 6 weeks crossing territory that was not safe to cross in order to reach this place. She was the sole survivor of Rena's original escort, and she looked exactly like a person who had been carrying that weight for 6 weeks without once setting it down. Rena told him the truth. She told it in pieces, the way truths come after a long time of partial truths, not with drama, not with apology, but completely. The ambush, Vex, the days alone. She did not minimize it and she did not perform it. She simply said what had happened, and he listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention that was itself a form of respect. When she finished, the fire had burned lower. He looked at it for a moment, organizing what he felt the way he organized everything, not to hide it but to understand it before he let it into the room. He asked about the mark on her arm, the Matriarch's mark. Every Iron Veil Matriarch receives it at investiture. It can't be removed. He asked about the ring, my mother's, and her mother's before her. He was quiet then. You were never in danger from me knowing. She said, I know that now. Did you know it then? She said, no, then I didn't have access to trust, any trust. I was in a state where the capacity for it was gone. He looked at her directly and she held the look, and he said, I understand that. Sable, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone who had been handed a document in an unfamiliar language and was deciding whether to find a translator or simply proceed, said something in Orc. Short and direct. Rena's response was shorter. Sable's posture shifted in the specific way of someone who has received a definitive answer and is registering it rather than accepting it. He asked what she had said. Rena said, I told her you're someone I trust and that will speak here as I choose. He said, I see. He got up and made tea, because it was what the situation called for. Because having something to do with his hands gave him room to be with what he was feeling, which was several things at once, and none of them simple. He was not angry. The anger, if there had been any, had passed quickly once he understood the circumstances. What he was instead was something more like the emotional equivalent of stepping onto ice you had believed was solid ground and finding it was only almost solid, not broken, just different from what you had placed your weight on. He had been building something here, quietly, without naming it, with the careful patience of someone who had learned that named things have a way of breaking under the weight of their own expectations. He had been building it on a foundation that was now revealed to be incomplete, not false. He was certain of that, but incomplete. The woman in the chair by the fire was the same woman who had corrected his vegetable cutting and beaten him at his own strategy game and sent a wolf back into the tree line with a sound from her throat. And she was also the matriarch of a mountain clan, the holder of a lineage going back 4 generations, the person whose seal pressed into her palm from the inside of her mother's ring. Both of those things had to live together in his understanding now. He poured the tea. He handed cups to all 3. He sat back down. He said, tell me about the Iron Veil. She looked at him. You want to hear about my clan? I want to understand your life, he said. The whole thing, if you're willing to tell it. Sable made a sound that was not a word. Rena looked at her captain for a moment, then back at him. And something in her face, something that had been pulled tight in the way things pull when they are braced for an impact that has not arrived, released. She began to tell him, Sable stayed 2 nights. She had a message to get back. She had a structure to set in motion. Rena's council needed to know the matriarch was alive, that Grass's attempt had failed, that the matriarch would return. There were political currents to arrest and traitors to name, and a clan to stabilize. The world outside this cabin had not stopped moving simply because Rena had been absent from it. On the morning of the second day, before the light was fully up and before Rena was awake, Sable found Rowan at the woodpile. She stood in the cold and looked at him with her soldier's eyes for a long moment before she spoke. She said in the careful accented version of his language that she had, "You sheltered the matriarch when she would have died otherwise. The Iron Veil takes that debt seriously. You'll be compensated, whatever is within our means." He said he didn't want compensation. She looked at him the way people look at statements that do not fit their working model of how things function. He said, "I helped her because she needed help, not because of what she was, not because I expected to be paid." Sable was quiet for a long moment. The snow between them was still, the cold morning air holding them both in a very particular light. Then she said, with the directness that he had learned was the Iron Veil way, not unkind, not ceremonial, simply the belief that the weight of a thing should be carried in its content and not its wrapping. She has not slept consecutively through a full night in 4 years. I have been her field captain for 6 years. I have never, in those 6 years, heard her laugh. She paused. I heard her laugh through this wall on the second evening I was here. He didn't know what to say to that. He said nothing. Sable looked at him for another moment, the assessment in her eyes completing something it had been working on since she arrived. She said, "I don't know what you are to each other, but you should know what you've done." She left the next morning with the younger warrior and a sealed letter from Rena, and she looked back at him once across the clearing before the horses took the tree line, and the look had lost most of its suspicion, though it had not yet found anything warmer to replace it with. He stood at the edge of the clearing and watched until the sound of the horses was gone entirely. Then he went inside. The conversation they had that evening was the hardest one. Rena sat in her chair and he sat on his floor mat, and the fire was lower than usual, and neither of them moved to fix it, and in the dimming light she told him what came next. She had to go back. That was not a choice. Her clan needed its matriarch, and there were traitors to face and systems to restore and a future to secure for people who were depending on her to come back and do exactly that. She could not stay in a hunter's cabin at the edge of a human forest, no matter what the cabin held. He said he knew that. She said, "There are things I want to say to you. I have been trying to find the way to say them." He said, "Then say them." She was quiet for a moment. The fire moved in the dimmer light. Her face was shadow and firelight, and she was not performing composure right now. He could see that she was simply sitting with what she felt, which was, he understood, something she rarely permitted herself. She said, "I came to your door believing that kindness was always a transaction, that there was no such thing as something given without a price attached to it." She stopped, started again. "You showed me something different from that, and I did not know how to receive it for a long time." She said, "I have spent my entire life being responsible for everyone else and having no one be responsible for me. Not in the small ways, not the way someone says, 'Let me look at your wound. Let me make your tea. Let me fix the thing you have been too tired to fix yourself.'" He was listening with his whole body. She said, "I do not want to leave here." A pause. "I know that I must, and those two things are both true, and I cannot resolve them tonight." He said, "I know." She set down her cup. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "I want to ask you something. I need you to hear it for what it is. Not an obligation, not a reward, not a political arrangement. It is only what it is. One person asking another person a question." He said, "Ask." She said, "When I have done what I must do, when I have gone back and faced grass and stabilized what needs to be stable, I want to come back here and ask you something properly." She paused. "I want to ask if you will come north with me, not as anything formal or official, just to come, to see where I come from, to let me show you the light I told you about." He said, "The blue-green winter light." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I'll be here." She looked at him with the focused attention of someone who does not know when they will see a thing again, and is not willing to be careless about it. He said, "I'm not going anywhere. Take care of what you need to take care of. Come back when you can." She said, "It might be months." He said, "I'll be here." She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. Then she said, "I finished the stone guardian. It's on the shelf." He turned. He had not seen her place it there. It sat on the middle shelf between the carved bird his mother had made and the copper coin with the hole through its center, and it was small and solid and unmistakably a dog, broad-chested, patient, watchful, carved with the precise attention of someone who understood that what you make with your hands carries what you meant when you made it. She had placed it there as if it belonged there. It did. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "It's exactly right." She left before dawn 3 days later, riding north with Sable's relay into the mountain dark, carrying a sealed letter and the bone-handled knife, and the ring turned face outward now, the seal visible, as it would need to be when she returned to her people. He walked her to the tree line. At the edge of the trees, she stopped and turned to face him. She said, "There is a word in my language for what you are to me. It does not translate well. The closest meaning is the one whose fire stays lit, the person whose presence makes a place into something more than a structure." She said she had never used that word for anyone before. She said she was not going to translate it into his language because it would lose something in the transition. But she wanted him to have it. He said the word slowly. He got it right. She looked at him with the beginning of that sound, the surprised laugh that had no dignity in it, and controlled it, but not completely. The part that escaped was warm in the cold morning air. She said, "You practiced." He said, "I had time." She reached out then, in the Iron Veil way, palm turned upward, hand extended, a gesture of offering rather than grasping. He placed his hand in hers, palm down. The way she had once shown him was the right response to it. Her hand was enormous around his and warm despite the cold. She held it for a moment, just a moment, and then let go. She walked to the horses. He stood at the tree line and watched until he could not see her anymore. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin and went inside and closed the door against the cold. The stone guardian sat on the shelf between the carved bird and the copper coin, and the fire burned low. And outside, the first thin light of morning was beginning to find the edges of the clearing, and the cabin held the quiet of a space that had been changed by what it had held and was now simply waiting to hold it again. He had told himself he was prepared for the quiet. He was prepared for it the way you are prepared for things you understand in your mind, but have not yet lived in your body, which is to say, not very prepared at all. The understanding and the living of it turned out to be different countries with different weather, and he arrived in the second one without the right equipment. The cabin was the same. That was the thing he had not anticipated. He had expected the absence to change the space somehow, to hollow it out or rearrange it. Instead, the cabin was exactly as it had always been. The same proportions, the same stone hearth, the same shelves, the same patched roof holding against the same wind. Everything in its place. The chair by the fire, the work table, the curtained corner, the stone guardian on the middle shelf. He looked at it every morning without meaning to. Not out of sentiment or not only. It was more that his eyes went there the way they went to the window to check the weather, automatically because the information mattered, because it told him something about the condition of things. The guardian sat between the carved bird and the copper coin, and it was the only thing on that shelf he had not placed there himself, and it communicated in its presence a kind of fact he had not had before. She had been here. She would come back. He worked. He checked his traps and reset them, and sold his catches at the Harrow Market on the days it ran and came back to the cabin before dark. He extended his east trap line because there was useful territory there he had been neglecting. He fixed the section of floor near the cold room door properly, using the right materials this time, doing it correctly from the start rather than correcting a correction. He patched the roof again, properly, with the flat-sided, heavy stone she had found by eye and set aside as obvious. And when he climbed down and looked up at his work, the memory of her balanced on the ridge of this cabin with the ease of someone for whom heights were simply not a variable was so specific and present that he stood in the cold for a moment, just letting it be there. He thought about the blue-green light. He did not let himself think about it every day. He allowed it in limited amounts, the way you allow yourself things that have the quality of being too good, carefully with restraint, so that the wanting doesn't become its own kind of weight. He thought about mountains he had never seen, and a language he did not speak, and what it would mean to be the only person in a room who was not built to the same scale as the room. He was afraid. This too he allowed himself to acknowledge in limited and honest doses. He was afraid of arriving in her world and being small in it, not physically small, though that would be true, but small in the deeper sense, inadequate, without context. A person who knew every trail in the Cascade foothills and the growth cycle of every medicinal plant in his mother's garden, and absolutely nothing about the internal politics of an orc clan that had been governing itself by unbroken law for 6 generations. He was afraid of being a liability to her, a complication she would have to manage, a thing her enemies would use and her allies would need to quietly forgive her for. He was afraid that what had grown in the contained quiet of a winter cabin, that specific, particular thing, with its particular weight and particular texture, would not survive exposure to a larger world that had not been consulted about its existence and had its own opinions about what was and wasn't possible. He sat with all of this on the evenings when the fire was the right height and the cabin was quiet in the specific way it was quiet now. And then he got up and carved a bird. It was rough. It was substantially less accomplished than the Stone Guardian by any objective measure. The proportions were approximate, the wings uneven, the head slightly too large for the body. He had not been trained to carve. He had no particular gift for it. He made the thing anyway over the course of a week of evenings, working at his table the way he worked on everything that mattered. Not quickly, not perfectly, but with full attention and the intention of getting it right even when it was not going right. When it was finished, he set it on the shelf, next to the Guardian. He stood back and looked at both of them together, her careful work and his imprecise work, side by side on the same shelf, and felt something settle in his chest that he did not try to name. Spring came the way spring comes in the Cascades. Not gently. It announced itself with 3 weeks of alternating thaw and refreeze, and then arrived all at once in a week of light so sharp and clear, it felt almost aggressive after the long gray of winter. The snowpack retreated up the slopes. The creek behind the cabin, which had been frozen solid since December, began to run again with the particular enthusiasm of water that has been patient for a long time. He heard the horses before he saw them. He was outside checking the south-facing edge of his mother's herb garden for the first tentative green of the earliest spring plants, and the sound came through the tree line. Not one horse or two, but several, moving with the organized rhythm of riders who knew where they were going. He stood up and turned toward the sound. They came through the gap in the tree line in a line, 6 riders in the gray and dark brown colors of the Iron Veil, their horses moving with the calm efficiency of animals that had covered significant ground and were nearly done with it. The riders wore the traveling gear of people who had been on the road for days and had maintained their standard throughout, because their standard was not a choice they made situationally. She was at the front. She was not in rags this time. Dark leather over lighter fabric, the cut precise and practical. Clearly the work of someone who understood that clothing communicates before you open your mouth. Her hair braided back in an elaborate formal pattern. The ring on her right hand with the seal facing outward, no longer pressed into her palm, no longer hidden. The bone-handled knife at her hip, the one she had carried through everything, still there and still right. She looked like what she was. She also looked like herself. Those two things had not always been the same, and he recognized in the specific way he had learned to read her that they were now. Something had been integrated. Something that had been in tension for a long time had found its way into alignment. She saw him when the horses cleared the tree line. She said something quiet to the rider on her left and then separated from the group and walked her horse the rest of the distance alone. He walked toward her. They met in the middle of the clearing in the early spring morning. The tree line behind her, the cabin behind him, the first real light of the season falling on both of them, and they looked at each other for a moment without speaking. She said, "I said I would come back." He said, "Yes." She said, "Grass has been removed from his position and tried according to Iron Veil law. His co-conspirators have been named and dealt with. The clan is stable. My position is secure." A pause. I have also spoken to my council and my 3 senior chiefs about you. I told them what you did and who you are and what I intend to ask. He said, what did they say? 2 of the 3 chiefs were in support. The third is unconvinced but will not oppose me. My council has concerns. That is their function, and I have addressed them. He said, and Sable? A slight movement at the corner of her mouth. Sable said she would reserve judgment until she had observed you in a context more demanding than a one-room cabin. He said, that seems fair? I thought so too. She held his eyes. Something in her face was doing the thing he had watched it do only in the most unguarded moments, moving toward the surface of itself, away from the careful management of expression that was as ingrained in her as the strategic training, the law knowledge, the weight of the matriarch's mark on her arm. She said, I am going to ask you something, Rowan. I am going to ask it the way my people ask things that matter, directly without ceremony, because we believe the weight of a question should live in what it means and not in how it is presented. He said, all right. She said, I am asking you to come north with me to the Iron Vale, not as a guest, not as a formal designation, not as a reward for something rendered. She held his eyes. I am asking you to come as the person I want beside me. She did not stop there. You will have your own space and your own role, built from what you actually are, rather than a title invented to justify your presence. You will not be required to be other than you are. She paused. You will face difficulty. There are people in my clan and in the surrounding territories who will not accept this easily, and I will not pretend otherwise. Another pause. I want to build something with you. I don't know its full shape yet. I know I want to try. The formality dropped from her voice then, just slightly, just enough. She said, I know what it cost you to make yourself comfortable with a small life. I know you built it carefully because the larger things had all gone wrong. I am not asking you to abandon what you've built. I am asking you to exchange one kind of life for another, and I cannot promise you the exchange is a good one. Well, she looked at him with the full weight of what she was. What I can promise is this. I will not disappear on you. I will not treat you as lesser. I will not ask you to be anything other than what you are. A breath. You told me you would be here when I came back. I am here. I am asking. He looked at her. He held all of it, the fear and the uncertainty, and the specific image of himself standing in a hall built for people twice his size with no language and no context. And he gave each thing its honest weight, because he was not a man who made significant decisions by pretending the hard parts weren't there. He thought about a stone guardian on a shelf and the word in her language that meant the one whose fire stays lit, and the 4 months of quiet that had taught him the difference between choosing solitude and mistaking it for the actual shape of his life. Then he said, I have one condition. She waited. He said, I'm bringing the shelf things. She looked at him. The sound moved across her face before she could stop it. That particular sound, the unguarded one, the one that had no dignity in it, the beginning of the laugh that escaped before the social mind arrived. She said, the bird, the coin, the guardian. He said, they go where I go. She said, obviously. He said, then yes. She looked at him for a long moment, and in her face was something he had been watching slowly build for months. Not the careful, guarded composure of a woman who had learned to show nothing, but the unguarded expression of a person who has received something they did not know how to hope for and are slightly overwhelmed by it. She said, in the Iron Vale, when you say yes to something like this, it is binding. We do not treat it as provisional. He said, good, I wasn't planning to. He packed what mattered and banked the fire and went to the door. He stood in the frame for a moment and looked at the structure he had built with his own hands 7 years ago, from worse materials than he would have chosen and better technique than he had started with. The patched roof, the woodpile, the herb garden, still mostly dormant, but beginning its annual argument with the ground about who was in charge. He thought about his mother, who had known every plant in that garden by name, not the botanical name, her name. He thought she would have had a great deal to say about where he was going, and that most of it would have been delivered with the specific combination of humor and absolute conviction that was her most consistent mode. He thought the humor part would have been at his expense, and the conviction part would have been entirely in his favor, and that both would have been correct. He closed the door. He walked to the horses. The Iron Vale compound was built into the north-facing flank of a cascade peak that had been chosen 6 generations ago for its defensibility, its access to the mountain passes, and its view of the valley that stretched south through the trees toward the territory that had once been contested and was now, through the consistent and costly work of those 6 generations, simply theirs. It was not a building. It was an integration. The stone of the walls was continuous with the stone of the mountain, not imposed on the rock face but grown from it, the kind of construction that takes generations and communicates, in every proportioned element, the intention of a people who had decided they were staying and were willing to build accordingly. He had expected it to be large. He had not expected it to make him feel the way it made him feel, which was not the inadequacy he had feared, but something more specific and stranger. He felt the way you feel in an old-growth forest, the particular sensation of being in a space that has absorbed the weight of many lives and is still absorbing yours. History in the stone, permanence in the grain of the timber, the accumulated presence of everyone who had stood in these halls and decided what the clan would do and how it would endure. He stood in the main entrance passage on the first day and breathed it in and tried to understand what he was standing inside. Rena stood beside him. She did not explain it. She let him look. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "The stonework on the arch, that's not structural. Someone added that." She said, "My great-grandmother. She spent 4 years on it." He looked at the arch, the precise layered carving that ran its circumference, formal and dense, and clearly the work of someone who had understood that beauty was not separate from permanence, but was, in its own way, part of what made a thing last. He said, "She was right to." Rena looked at him. He was still looking at the arch. She said nothing, but something in her face moved in the way he had learned to watch for. The first week was hard. He would say that plainly and without self-pity because it was simply true, and minimizing it would have been dishonest. He was the only human in the compound. He was shorter than the shortest adult orc in the hall by a head, which meant that every corridor and table and doorway in the place was designed for a scale that was not his, and that he experienced every physical space as a mild but continuous reminder of this fact. People noticed him, not always with hostility, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with the blank assessment of people encountering something genuinely novel and not yet having decided how to file it. But they noticed, and the noticing was constant, and there was no interval in any given day when he could forget that he was something this environment had not been built to include. Rena had given him a room with a window that looked out at the approach to the hall. She had assigned him Fennec, 17 years old, genuinely enthusiastic, with a vocabulary in his language composed largely of trade words and fragments from what sounded like old songs, but who compensated for this with a remarkable willingness to use his entire body when words failed. Rowan liked him immediately, which surprised him somewhat, and suspected Rena had chosen him with some care. He learned. He had always learned this way, by watching, by doing, by making the mistakes that happened before you understood the rules and treating them as information rather than failure. He learned the basic courtesy words in Iron Vale dialect and used them consistently. He learned which seats at the long table were designated and which were fluid. He learned that the orc greeting involved a specific formality of eye contact that could be misread as aggression by someone who didn't know, and that their humor ran direct and physical in ways that required recalibration. He also learned that he was being assessed, not unkindly, but seriously. The senior figures of the clan watched him with the thorough, patient attention of people who had survived 6 generations by being careful about what they allowed into their structure. The thing that would determine how this went was not where he came from. It was whether he proved useful in the way the Iron Vale understood usefulness, through action, through consistency, through showing up in the ways that mattered when it would have been easier not to. He understood this without being told. It was, in its basic logic, not so different from the forest. The first test came in the second week. A messenger from a border clan arrived at the hall in the controlled aggression of someone carrying a grievance they considered legitimate and had been authorized to present with force. The trade route dispute had been building for months, and the messenger had been sent with instructions to make the Iron Vale's delay in addressing it uncomfortable. Rena was in council with her chiefs. Rowan was in the main hall with Fennec, working through vocabulary with the small game board he had brought north. He had found it useful as a teaching tool, the shared activity providing structure for the language work. When the messenger arrived, the duty guard received him, and the messenger looked across the hall at Rowan with an expression that communicated several things in rapid succession, none of them subtle. Fennec went very still. Rowan set down the game piece he was holding. He said, in Ironvale, that was rough but functional. He had been practicing this specific phrase for 3 days because he had learned to anticipate what situations would require before they required it, that the matriarch was in council and would receive the messenger when she was available, and that in the meantime, could he offer tea? The messenger stared at him. Rowan looked back with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent years alone in the forest developing patience. Not performed calm, not managed calm, but the genuine article, the kind that does not shift under observation because it has nothing to perform. He had used it on wounded animals in difficult winters in the specific loneliness of a cabin at the edge of the tree line, and it turned out to transfer. He made the tea himself in the hall kitchen with the alarmed cook hovering in the background, and brought it back and set it in front of the messenger without ceremony, and returned to his vocabulary work. Fennec was looking at him with an expression that had moved past terrified into something that was going to become a story told for years. Rena came out of council 20 minutes later. She stopped when she saw the arrangement. Messenger and her human on opposite sides of the hall, a cup of tea between them, and a silence that had settled into something that was no longer what it had been when the messenger arrived. She asked the messenger if he had been attended to. He said, with the quality of a man being somewhat honest against his will, that he had. The meeting that followed went well. Not perfectly, because the dispute was real and required actual negotiation. But well, the messenger left the next morning with a provisional agreement and a package of the tea that the hall kitchen had prepared at their own insistence once they understood what had happened. Aldrich found him that afternoon. The senior chief of the Ironvale's Eastern Branch had been chief longer than Rowan had been alive, and had the look of a man who had watched a great many things happen and had developed, through that watching, a reliable sense for which of them would last. He sat across from Rowan in the small study Rena had arranged for him and looked at him with pale amber eyes that were very direct. He said, "You understand you will never be entirely comfortable here." Rowan said, "I know." "Yeah," he said, "there will always be those who see you and see only the difference." Rowan said, "I know that too." Aldrich said, "What do you have that makes the difficulty worth it?" Rowan thought about it. He did not answer quickly because the question deserved its full weight. He said, "I have her, and I have the sense that what we're building matters, not just to us." Aldrich looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "The matriarch carries too much alone, always has. Her mother was the same, never allowed herself an ally she fully trusted." He paused. "I think perhaps our matriarch has finally found one." He stood. He inclined his head in the slight, deliberate way that Rowan had learned was the iron veil gesture of respect between equals. Not subordinate to superior, not superior to subordinate, but the acknowledgement of one person to another that they are standing on level ground. Then he left. Rowan sat in the small study after Aldrich was gone. He looked at the shelf he had set up in his room, visible from the doorway, where the carved bird and the copper coin and the stone guardian sat in their new arrangement. He thought about all the rooms he had sat in alone, in the cabin at the tree line, in the years after his mother died, in the long gray winters of a life he had made small on purpose to protect himself from the loss of anything larger. He thought, "I am in a mountain hall in the far north, and I do not belong here in the way I have always not belonged anywhere, and I am building something here anyway." He thought, "That is what I have always done." He went back to the main hall. The second test came from Colt. He was 35, the son of the Western Branch chief, broad in the way that the Ironvale built broad, and he had, from what Fennec communicated with enthusiastic and slightly excessive detail, considered himself a natural presence in the matriarch's inner circle. Not a suitor. He was too politically careful for anything so direct. But someone whose proximity to power was an ambition. And Rowan's presence had complicated that ambition in ways that Colt was too disciplined to address openly and too honest to fully conceal. He challenged Rowan to what the Iron Veil had for this purpose. Not combat, which the size differential made obviously inappropriate, and which Colt was too intelligent to propose, but a traditional problem-solving contest. A test of resourcefulness, open between any two members of the hall regardless of size or background, adjudicated by the senior chiefs. The problem was real. The eastern water channel that fed the hall's lower kitchens had a section that froze every winter. Solid, reliable, inconvenient. The workers assigned to it spent the first hour of every cold morning breaking through the ice by hand. Physical work, repetitive and with a consistent rate of injury to wrists and shoulders that had been accepted as simply the cost of the channel's location. Colt presented first. His proposals were logical and thorough and built from the perspective of someone who thought primarily in terms of what the Iron Veil did well, which was apply strength and organization to problems. More workers on rotation, a better tool for the ice breaking, a modified schedule that distributed the burden differently. They were good solutions. Rowan spent 2 days on the channel before he presented anything. He followed it from its source point in the mountain's natural drainage to the kitchen inlet, walking the full length in the cold, with Fennec trailing behind him asking questions that Rowan answered in pieces while he looked at what he was actually looking at. He crouched at the problem section and looked at the geometry of it, the way the channel ran, the exposure angle, the specific depth at which the freeze was happening, the relationship between the channel's bed and the air above it. He thought about his mother's garden and the way water moved through soil. He thought about the passive systems she had built for the plants that needed consistent moisture. He thought about the difference between fighting a problem and changing the conditions that created it. On the third day, he stood before the assembled chiefs and Rena and Colt and said, "Reline the problem section of the channel with flat stone from the east slope, available the right thermal mass, and install a fitted wooden cover system over the top, sized and sealed to insulate the water from the coldest air. The stone would retain the day's heat longer than the current earthen bed. The cover would prevent the surface freeze that spread downward. The cost was 1 week of initial labor. The ongoing maintenance was minimal. The problem would not recur." He drew it out in rough strokes on the slate board they used for presentations. It was not complicated. It was not impressive to look at. It was correct, and it was the kind of correct that would hold for 20 years without requiring anyone to revise it. Colt said, with the precise courtesy that was both his strength and his tell, "It's a simple solution." Rowan said, "The best solutions usually are." In the brief silence that followed, Rena was watching from her seat at the head of the table. She had watched the entire presentation with the stillness she brought to things that required her full attention. She had watched Colt's proposals with the focused neutrality of a leader assessing options. And she had watched Rowan's proposal with something else. Not neutrality, not the performance of objectivity, but the specific quality of attention that came when something confirmed a thing you had known without being able to prove it. She thought, he does not need me to defend him. He does not need me to position him or explain him or stand between him and the assessment of people who are not yet sure what to make of him. He is doing what he does, looking at the actual problem, finding the actual solution, offering it without drama. And what he needs from her is not protection. He needs her beside him. That was what she had asked him for, and it was what he was asking of her in return. And she understood in that moment that the exchange was real and equal and would require the same thing from both of them, to stop managing each other and simply stand in the same place. She looked at Aldrich. Aldrich said, "Do it." The meeting concluded. Colt left with his dignity intact and his opposition substantially reduced. Over the following weeks, he moved from watching Rowan with calculation to watching him with something that had, at its best moments, the texture of grudging respect. Rowan treated him with consistent straightforwardness, neither seeking his approval nor rejecting the possibility of it. And this turned out to be the correct approach, because the Iron Veil respected people who did not need to be liked but were willing to be fair. The white slate appeared on the shelf on the third morning. He had been arranging the objects from home carefully. The carved bird, the copper coin with the hole through its center, the stone guardian. He had looked at the three of them together in this new context, these small things that had traveled with him from a cabin in the Cascade foothills to a mountain hall in the northern range, and found that they were not diminished by the new setting. They were the same things they had always been. He had not expected the fourth item. It was a piece of slate, smooth and pale, the size of his two hands placed together. Rena had carved into its face a design he recognized as part of the Iron Veil's formal mark. Not the full clan seal, but a specific element of it, the kind that appeared at the border of official documents and on the entrance stones of protected structures. He went to find her. She was in the strategy room with two of her advisors. She saw his expression and said something to the advisors, and they left. He held up the slate. He said, "What does this mean?" She said, "Under my protection." He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." He said, "Thank you." She said in the voice she used for the things that were most true, was without ceremony, without framing, simply, "You are mine to protect. That is not a burden. It is a choice I am making clearly so that you understand it." He stood with the slate in his hands and understood it completely. He went back and placed it on the shelf. It sat next to the stone guardian she had carved in a cabin during a snowstorm, and the bird he had carved in the 4 months she was gone, and the coin he had found in a river when he was 20 and kept for reasons he had never been able to fully explain. The shelf was full. The ceremony happened in the spring of the following year. It was not a human ceremony and not entirely an Iron Veil ceremony. Rena had worked with her lawkeepers and advisors for 2 months to build something that honored both traditions. And the result was a thing that neither side had done before and that some people on both sides found strange. And that was, precisely because of that, the right shape for what it was. 3 people came up from Harrow. Doris Engel, who had known his mother for 30 years and had opinions about everything and expressed them without being asked. The Iron Veil, to Rowan's private satisfaction, found her entirely comprehensible and gave her a seat near the front. A former neighbor named Harris, who had always been decent and who looked at the Iron Veil Hall with the wide eyes of a man who had driven 6 hours expecting something unusual and had not prepared adequately for the scale of what he found. And Claire, his former fiancée, who had come with her husband and their 2 children and who stood in the main entrance passage with her hands over her mouth when she first saw the hall, the assembled Iron Veil, and Rowan standing in the stone corridor with the mountain rising behind the walls. She found him before the ceremony. She said when she could say anything, "Rowan, I am so glad for you." She meant it. He could see that she meant it completely. He said, "I'm glad you came." She looked at him for a moment, at the ease with which he stood in this enormous space, at the specific quality of settled that he had not had when she knew him, and she said, "You found your place." He said, "I found who I was supposed to find." The ceremony was conducted by Rena's lawkeeper, a woman of considerable age and obvious authority who had been doing this longer than most people in the hall had been alive, and by Doris Engel from Harrow, who turned out to have a great deal to say about the nature of good men and the patience required to recognize them, and said it with a directness that the Iron Veil received with evident approval. The vows were spoken in both languages. He had practiced his in Iron Veil for 3 weeks. He did not get them perfect. He got them right, which was different. And Rena's expression when he spoke them was the kind of expression that belongs on a person's face when they receive something they had stopped letting themselves fully want. The binding cord was braided from 2 materials, the dark-dyed wool from the Iron Veil's traditional fiber work and a dried stem from his mother's herb garden, which he had brought north wrapped in careful paper that he had changed twice during the journey to make sure it arrived intact. The cord was made by Sable, who had asked to be the one to make it and had done so with the focused precision she brought to everything that mattered. Aldrich stood among the Iron Veil witnesses. Colt stood at the back of the hall and left before the feast, which was the most acceptance they were likely to get from him and which was received without comment or drama by everyone who understood how these things worked. Sable stood at Rena's left shoulder, where she had always stood, and looked at Rowan across the hall with the expression that had become, over the months of watching and assessing and slowly and reluctantly revising, something he recognized as its own particular warmth. Compressed, practical, the warmth of someone who assessed things slowly and carefully and had arrived, after long assessment, at approval. She inclined her head when she caught him looking. He inclined his in return. Afterward, in the quiet of their shared rooms before the feast began, Rena sat on the edge of the bed, too large for him, but he had gotten used to it in the way you get used to things that are imperfect and correct simultaneously, and looked at the shelf, the bird, the coin, the guardian, the white slate with the protection mark. And now added that morning a small length of the binding cord. He had asked for a piece of it before it was woven into the ceremony, and it lay coiled on the shelf like a question that had been answered. She said, "You have a full shelf." He said, "I've been working on it." She looked at the shelf for a long moment. Then she said, in the quiet, direct way she had with the things that were most true, "I want you to know something. When I came to your door, I expected at best basic decency, the minimum kindness that would let me survive the night. I did not expect to be seen." He said, "You're very easy to see when you let yourself be seen." She said, "I'm learning that it's safe to do that." A pause. "You're the reason I'm learning that." He didn't answer immediately. He received it the way he received important things, quietly with the full attention it required, letting it settle before deciding whether it needed words. Then he said, "When I opened my door that night, I thought I had nothing to offer. I'd been thinking that for years, that I had nothing worth anything to anyone." She said his name, just his name, the way she said it now. He said, "I know, I'm not saying it's still true. I'm saying I know how it felt, and you changed what that meant. You didn't ask me to be anything other than what I was, and you found it enough. That was the thing I didn't know I needed." She moved with the quiet, purposeful certainty that was entirely her. Not the performed certainty of the early weeks, not the managed composure of a matriarch presenting herself to her council, just the settled certainty of a person who has learned that the space she takes up in the world is not an imposition, but a presence. And she sat beside him on the edge of the too large bed. She put her arm around his shoulders. This required her to curve inward slightly, which she had learned to do over the year of living at two different scales. Learned it the way she learned things she decided to keep, systematically and then naturally, and then without thinking about it at all. Her arm was warm and heavy and real. Outside the window, the mountain spring was in its first bright, particular green, the kind that only exists for 2 weeks before it deepens into summer and is never quite the same shade again. Below them, the hall was beginning to make the sounds of a celebration getting underway, the percussion of large bodies on stone floors, the first notes of music he had spent a year listening to carefully enough that he had found inside its unfamiliar rhythms, the things that made it beautiful. He was here. He was genuinely, verifiably here. Not in the provisional way he had been here for most of the year, waiting to see if the ground would hold, but fully here, in the way that only becomes possible when you have stopped protecting yourself from the place you are standing. He said, "We should go down to the feast." She said, "Yes." Neither of them moved immediately. She said, "Rowan?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You had everything to offer. You simply didn't know it yet." He sat with that. The stone guardian on the shelf, the cord braid, the white slate with the protection mark, the word in her language that meant the one whose fire stays lit, the word he had practiced until he got it right, the word he carried the way he carried the copper coin. Not because he needed to display it, but because it was true, and true things were worth the wait. He said, "I'm beginning to understand that." She stood and pulled him up gently, in the way she had learned to do things at his scale. Not with less strength, but with the particular calibration of a person who has decided that care is not weakness, but precision. They went to the door together. The deep winter came the following year in the mountain territories with a severity that made the winters he had known in the Cascade foothills look moderate. For weeks, the cold pressed down from the peaks with the particular authority of elevation, squeezing the warmth from everything it touched, and the compound settled into the rhythms of a people who had survived many such winters and knew how. Rowan had been at the Iron Vale for 7 months by then. His Iron Vale dialect was functional and improving. He had developed a working relationship with the hall's kitchen that centered on the medicinal herb knowledge his mother had left him, which had proven unexpectedly useful in ways he had not anticipated. The Iron Vale had their own plant knowledge, deep and well-maintained, but his mother's lowland expertise covered gaps their mountain tradition didn't, and the trade of knowledge had gone in both directions and had opened more doors than the water channel solution. He knew which seat was his at the long table. He knew Aldrich's habit of arriving early to council and standing at the window, and had fallen into the quiet company of that habit on the mornings when he had reason to be there. He knew that Fennec, when stressed, translated emotion into physical activity, and could be observed doing unnecessary maintenance on things that were already perfectly maintained, and that the best response to this was simply to hand him a useful tool and work alongside him without comment until the stress had found its level. He was building a life, imperfectly, incrementally, with constant learning and occasional embarrassing failures of language and custom. But genuinely and seriously, he was building it. One morning he woke to find the light different. He had not been asleep deeply. The cold had a way of sitting in the room despite the fire, the specific cold of high elevation that found the spaces between warmth. And he surfaced gradually, aware before he was fully conscious that something about the quality of the light coming through the window was not the usual gray of a winter morning. He went to the window. It was there. The light she had described to him in a cabin at the edge of a human forest, on an evening when she had surprised herself by saying it out loud, in the voice of someone accessing a memory they had not thought about in a long time. A low blue-green that settled over the snow-covered slopes like something breathing, lit from some direction that was not quite any of the compass points, turning the white world into something that had no analog in any landscape he had ever known. It was not dramatic. It was not the sweeping, cinematic kind of beauty that demanded acknowledgement. It was the quietest and most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. The kind of beauty that requires stillness to receive, that exists for the people who are already looking, rather than for the ones who need to be called over. He stood at the window in the cold for a long time. He heard her in the doorway behind him. She was an early riser, always had been, and he had learned the specific sound of her movement in the hall outside their rooms, the particular weight and rhythm of her steps, identifiable before she was visible, the way you learn the sounds of a place that has become yours. She came to stand beside him at the window without saying anything, and she looked at the light with him, and neither of them said anything for a while. They had gotten very good over the year at the useful silence, the kind that was not absence but presence, the kind that meant they were in the same place at the same time and both aware of it and neither needed to add anything to that. After a while, she said, "You see it, just it." He said, "I see it," and she said, "I have looked at this light since I was very small. I have never shared it with anyone who was seeing it for the first time." He said, "Thank you for bringing me here to see it." She reached out and took his hand. Not the formal iron veil gesture, not the extended palm, the simple, direct thing that he had taught her, palm to palm, fingers interlaced, the human way. She had adopted it sometime in the autumn without announcement, the way she adopted things she decided she wanted to keep. Her hand was warm. They stood at the window in the blue-green light until it shifted, as it always did, back toward the ordinary colors of morning. The world returned to its usual whites and grays and the particular dark green of the old-growth trees on the lower slopes, and the extraordinary thing became the ordinary morning, and they were still standing there together. She said in a voice that was quiet and without ceremony, "When I was on my doorstep, I mean your doorstep, in the snow, when I was standing at your door with nothing left and I asked you not to let me die there, I was asking for one night of warmth, and then I would figure out the rest." He looked at her. She was looking at the mountain, at the place where the blue-green light had been. There was no version of that moment in which I could have told you what it would become. I couldn't have imagined it. I had no framework for it." She paused. "I have spent my life planning for every outcome, training for every contingency, preparing for the thing before it arrives so that when it arrives I am ready." Another pause, quieter. "I was not prepared for you." He said, "I wasn't prepared for you either." She turned to look at him then, full face, direct, the way she looked at things she was not going to be careful about. She said, "I was afraid for a long time. Not of you, of what it would mean to need something, to let myself need it specifically and acknowledge it specifically and say it out loud to someone who could hear it." She said, "I was afraid that if I said it and it went wrong, I would not survive losing it. That I had built myself to survive many things, but not that particular loss." He said, "I know." She said, "You knew." He said, "I knew. I was afraid of the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I am glad we were both afraid and did it anyway." He said, "So am I." Outside, the morning was becoming but so. The light normalizing, the compound beginning to stir with the sounds of a people starting another day in a place they had built to last. Somewhere below them, someone was in the kitchen, and the smell of the morning fire was finding its way up through the stone corridors. And Fennec was almost certainly already awake and doing something unnecessary and energetic somewhere in the hall. The shelf held the carved bird and the copper coin and the stone guardian and the white slate and the coil of the binding cord, and all of it was still exactly right, and all of it was in the right place. He had opened a door in a snowstorm and found the thing he had stopped believing he would find. She had come to a stranger's doorstep with nothing and been given everything that mattered. Against all expectation, against every reason they had been given to believe otherwise, by their own losses, their own carefully constructed solitudes, their own long practice of surviving without needing. They had been enough for each other. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, not without the ongoing labor of two people learning to live in a world that had not been designed with either of them fully in mind, but genuinely and seriously, and in the way that only becomes possible when you have stopped protecting yourself from the thing you most want. The fire in the hearth held its warmth against the mountain cold. The stone guardian watched the room with the patient expression of something carved by hands that understood what they were making and why it mattered. And outside the window, in the deep winter light of the Cascade Peaks, the world went on in its old, indifferent, extraordinary way, carrying them both inside it. That was enough. It was exactly enough.